concept of style might inform our understanding of what it is the dancer does while dancing. Here, when I say dancing, I'm focusing on the sort of activity that is made and performed by appreciation by an audience, including in those arenas in which the dance participants are appreciators as well. So it would include social dance. As such, I'm honing in on the kind of dance that is art, but I don't just mean a fine art. I'm talking about any sort of performative and appreciative practice in a history in either the fine arts or the everyday arts in a Deweyan sense in social spheres. From there, in section 3, I'll present a theory of dancing style, which I'm going to initial caps as dancing style to make it clear that's what I'm talking about, my view, that includes an account of entrained motor cognition that I call artistic entrainment. This theory of artistic entrainment holds that dance performers have body schemas, following Michelle Merritt's use of that term, of motor cognition that contain semiotic markers of their individual and cultural styles within their chosen genres, and that this entrainment can be at the amateur or expert level. I'll end this section by reasserting my view of dancing style as an activity theory of style, one that holds, among other things, that dancing style is a way of dancing that includes both choices and unconscious elements. I'll then use this theory to form the basis for the theoretical desiderata for what I'll be looking for in the enactivist theories in section 4. Lastly, in section 4, I'll survey a few of the enactivist theories that handle social cognition and culture, those of Sean Gallagher, Daniel Hutto, and Eric Rietveld and their co-authors, and navigate these in order to select the candidates that I think are the best fit for my thoughts on how dancing style works. After that, I'm going to briefly discuss Richard Menery's cognitive integration view, but I haven't done enough research on that to do it thoroughly, and say why I think it's less helpful, at least preliminarily, for explaining dancing style than the others. I'm not going to canvass here any traditional theories of mine, such as theory theories or simulation theories. I'll have to, that would be a longer piece. All right. So here I'm going to separate out two main categories of style that appear in the Western philosophical aesthetics literature. Those that refer to style as either A, an appreciable feature or quality of an object or structure, or B, a mode of action or agency that can be appreciated in its own right as a focus of aesthetic or artistic appreciation. One might appreciate stylistic agency, for example, by observing a style-laden process or practice of doing or making. A style feature might be a relational or contextual property, such as Cubist or from the Victorian era, and need not be formal and embodied, such as a property like red or landscape or in iambic pentameter. For ease of reference, I'll call the theories that fall within category A structure theories, and the theories that appear under category B activity theories. This is similar but not identical to Kendall Walton's distinction between product and process theories in style. It's usually not enough for style in either category for the stylistic feature or mode of action to occur only once. Instead, the literature usually treats style as a habitual feature, and I'm stressing that because habit's going to be something I'm looking for in the enactivist views. Mode or symptomatic trait that runs through some set of products or processes that can be grouped together in some way that is indicative of style. Right, so structure theories. These often hold that style inheres in abstract and other kinds of semiotic structures. Some structure theories treat style as a feature or quality that can be appreciated in cultural artifacts, signs, abstract or perceivable formal structures or systems of forms, metaphors, texts, patterns, and gestures. When discussing types of art, for example, it's the painting object, sculpture, or architectural edifice. Rietveld talks about architecture. The structure, the score, let's say, of the piece of music, or the dance as conceived of as a structure that's perceived and appreciated by the audience that contains these structures in which the style adheres. There are structure only or structure mostly theories of style, and others where style is treated as both a structure and an activity. Kendall Walton says, for example, that we can appreciate music both by hearing it and by playing it. Still, others find that the structure and activity arise and are appreciated together. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but here's the list. And I'm just going to say that theorists with structural views in style include Naomi Cumming, Signs and Gestures following C.S. Peirce, Nelson Goodman on metaphorical exemplification and concrete or abstract structures, Leonard Meyer in patterns, Joseph Margolis in intentional artifacts, Meyer Shapiro, systems of forms, Mary Surridge and Adina Armalajos for Dance, Metaphorical Exemplification in Abstract Structure following Goodman, and Richard Wollheim when he's talking about style descriptions in painting. He also has an activity theory. The activity theories of style treat style as a mind-involved way of doing, making, or performing an abstract or semiotic structure, text, or pattern that's detectable in the doer or maker's performance. Style theorists in this category include me. In my article where I said that style is part of a dancer's intentional and artistic agency, but I also think it's perceived and appreciated in the performance and can show up in the structure. But since it's primarily activity, that's what I'm going to say that I am. Arthur Danto, who holds that style is adverbial, a how rather than a what. E.H. Gombrich, who says that style is any distinctive and therefore recognizable way in which an act is performed or an artifact made or ought to be performed or made. Leonard B. Meyer, who says that style is in behavior of patterning or in artifacts produced by this behavior. And Richard Wollheim, in his view of style that occurs in processes in the pictorial arts, which includes the painter's rule-governed activity and their disposition to act according to the rule. Right, so my theory. My view of style in dance performing is an activity theory of style that I'm going to call dancing style, not to make it fancy, but just to distinguish it from dancing style in general. This is an extension, expansion, and clarification of the view of style that I shared in my 2014 article, Improvisational Artistry in Live Dance Performance as Embodied and Extended Agency. There, I was scared of enactivism, and so I just took a few little baby steps towards embodied, extended, and embedded, following Andy Clark. Now I'm going to take one more step and try to get into enactivism, but it's missing the enactivist component there for that reason. I didn't want to go too far thinking that I wouldn't be able to get back, whereas if you can always, it's easier to move forward than move backwards sometimes in art and in life and in philosophy. All right. So there, as is here, my primary focus was on the dance performer's intentional agency, quad dance artist in the course of performing. There I did the following. I defined improvisational artistry as a process that either draws on resources from the domain of a dancer's individual choices, but I called style I for individual, or the domain of what they've been taught by others in culture, what I call style T for taught. This is similar but not the same as Dina Armalagos and Mary Surridge's views, even though they separate out style in a similar way. Both forms of style are described as constrained by the artist's entrainment, schemas, and developed habits in embodied and extended ways. I also clarified that both forms of style are construed as subject to the physical, psychological, and emotional constraints of the performer or performer space, or maybe both together, as well as by any constraints of genre, method, culture, history, artistic director, choreography, etc. I also define dancing style as an adverbial way of dancing, and that I'm going to retain, that gives certain recognizable features or qualities to a dance performance that tell the audience something about its origin or method of creation. What I'm going to add now is to clarify that this is aesthetic. I don't usually need to do this when I'm talking to aesthetics philosophers, but given the conversations we've had this week about the aesthetic, I think it's necessary. So I'm going to clarify the aesthetic component of this view. I think that all artistic style has aesthetic valence, even if an artwork's aesthetic is one that resists emotional expressivity, as in Yvonne Rainer, who said no to moving and being moved. She's now switched to that, but originally she was part of the group of saying no to expressivity. I don't limit the concept of aesthetic here, as it once was historically, to the beautiful or to the sublime, or as tied only to the sensory modalities of hearing and vision. For a good overview of the historic background of the aesthetic sense, Barbara Montero's proprioception as an aesthetic sense has a good discussion of that. That's a 2006 article. Instead, I'm using a sense of aesthetic, which includes visceral and cognitive pleasure in such negative and bodily aesthetic senses that we might typically think are bad, like they're smelly or they're nauseating. Carolyn Korsmeyer talks about this in her work on the aesthetics of disgust. We also can take pleasure in what's frightening, as we can see in people who love horror stories. That's shown in Noel Carroll's work. I'd also include kinesthetic senses as senses, and include touch and the feeling of vibrations. Dominic McIver Lopez does work on the aesthetics of touch. These experiential aesthetic responses are an integral part of both perception and intentional thought. Okay, the the adding in of something specific on intentional as well as perception is important, because I'm going to be looking for an enactivist view that can handle that. And here I'm following from the work of Charles S. Peirce and John Dewey in their references to qualitative thought, which they describe as feelings such as attraction, repulsion, and the like towards the environment as well as physical sensations, and William James's idea of the role of sensation in thinking. There's so much more that could be said on that, but I'm going to leave it there for now. So these expansions are not enough, however, to satisfy the enactivists who want to know what exactly is involved in developing a culturally informed way of moving within a culture. As soon as I started reading that, I thought, okay, I don't do any studies, so they're not going to like that. But let me see if I can get more precise on the things they are talking about. They also want to know what the motivations for the style amount to, whether they are expressive or instrumental. I kind of don't think that dichotomy is a legit one for once that I'm going to discuss. Enactivist accounts, for example, differ on how culture affects thought, how the process of learning and culture takes place, and which of these activities involve perceptual processes, intentionality, the body, the brain, whether or not these activities can be reduced to naturalistic biological explanation, and whether the sort of higher order cognition involved in expert dance style requires a goal direction of the sort that relies on top-down processes and task direction. Whew. There are other issues, of course, but these are general. Start to give the reader the lay of the land and be explored more fully in the next section. As you probably can tell by now, I'm not justifying any of this view on the basis of science or experiments or any of those things, but the pragmatic constraint that David Davies talks about and that Renee Conroy mentioned the other day. All right, so to gather the pieces we have so far, my concept of dancing style is an activity rather than a structure theory of style, one where style is part and parcel of a dance performer's entrained, skilled, and intentional agency that is developed in culture, not reducible to biology, although dancers while training use their natural physiologies as the base for the development of their culturally influenced ways of habitual and often skilled embodied performing. I'm using italics to flag for us the concepts I'm going to be looking for in the enactivist theories. Aesthetic, it involves perceptual, qualitative, and intentional thought aimed at providing aesthetic experience for the participants and the appreciators. And culturally emergent, but still an individual dancer style. Individual choices affect the style that results, but it's something more happens with style than can be reducible to biological processes. In short, I think my view of dancing style connects well. This is, my beginning work, so I'm sure you guys will correct me if I'm wrong, with Sean Gallagher and Daniel Hutto's view of cultural permeation rather than cognitive penetration. That moving is sometimes part of thinking. This also borrows from Michelle Merritt, which I take to include the intentional thought of dance moving, and that trained enactivist thought can thereby lead to habit, in this case, a habitual way of moving, which includes the development of higher order and skilled use of affordances through the development of keenly aware artistic perception. In addition, I think it complements Eric Reitfeld's view that rich landscapes of affordances are dependent on the skilled intentional framework, that's his term, that is a hallmark of higher cognition, that is part of cultural and social material forms of life, and that there is no need for hierarchical or pre-structured cognitive architecture in order to think within this context. These enactivist views take as foundational ecological psychologist James J. Gibson's view of affordances. This is an easy one to connect to my idea that individual dance artists can and do draw from natural and cultural resources, not separately, but together, since these are not two different faculties when they're performing dance. Thus, dancing style can be seen as one that emerges from the interchange, interaction, and joint development of psychophysical motor abilities within a cultural environment that includes certain practices, education, training, and influences. The decision to choose one affordance rather than another is where both skill and individual aesthetic and artistic choice comes in. as the intentional agent feels attracted to or repulsed by one choice rather than another. That this was the Peircean insight, for aesthetic as well as for instrumental reasons. We saw this earlier this week in the case of discussing the vibe, which is perhaps another way to describe the positive aesthetic value of participating in a house dance. Less well suited to my view, but I've only just started to look at it, so I'm just going to make that a preliminary decision. It just smells wrong, feels wrong. There's an affectivity to there. Is Richard Menery's view of cognitive integration rather than permeation, which I will reject pending further research as requiring a separate process of top-down representational thought that I don't think is necessary. So let's start with cultural permeation. The question of how a dancer learns style and culture, as I hold at the level of philosophy of mind, is summed up nicely by Sean Gallagher in his book, Action and Interaction. He explains the issue this way. In some sense, it may all come down to an understanding of neuroscience and how we conceive of the workings of perceptual networks. There definitely is a split-second processing involved in the complex dynamical neural activations of social perception. The question is whether we should interpret these neural activations as one set of sensory early perceptual processes plus the addition of a second set of top-down mind reading processes that through inferential processes shape the end result, or as a coherent distributed processing that already includes more than sensory processing and is characterized by network plasticity. So I think I've got it right in my reading comprehension that this highlighted part is Gallagher's view. Right. I think this makes perfect sense. In holding there's no second set of top-down processes for reasons based not in neuroscience but in dance practice. When one dances in a style, it's quite plausible to me that they're able to do so because their, quote, perceptual processes at the subpersonal level are already shaped by mechanisms of plasticity by bodily, enactive, and environmental, including social and cultural factors and prior experience, close quote. So whether or not this version of enactivism can account for all thought, it clearly does seem to explain how it is that perception, interpretation, and intentionality are ingrained, embedded, and entrenched in both individual and social bodies. In Gallagherian and Huttonian enactivist terms, perception is permeated by rather than penetrated by culture. What I will next have to decide is whether this permeation is equivalent to Joseph Margolis's idea that culture is emergent from biology. This is difficult to do because Margolis's work is not steeped in cognitive science or neuroscience, and I need to really think about how influenced I was by his view when he was my advisor undergraduate, and think about it afresh, which I haven't yet done. What the two ideas have in common, so far as I can tell, is this is cultural permeation and cultural emergence, is that there's no intentional action that doesn't involve culture at some level in a thoroughly integrated way. Both concepts can also account for the idea that higher order as well as lower cognition has been culturally preformed. Hutto, for example, and co-authors argue that, quote, human cognition is not only shaped by, but utterly permeated by pattern practices embedded in sociocultural contexts within which these practices grow and develop, close quote. Pattern practices, including dance practices such as learning and performing of intricate choreography, can range from the simple to the extremely complex, as I've mentioned. The kind of artistry involved in dancing style at the highest level of achievement can be extremely sophisticated, as in the case of expert dance performing. And if we can acknowledge that goal-directed intentionality is involved in order to achieve highly nuanced and refined expressivity, which I think is true, something that in art involved conceptual and body-based understanding and not just biology-based raw emotion, then I think that this is consistent. These two things are consistent in this way. All right. Sean Gallagher and Mia Burnett point out, following John Carvalho, that uptake of affordances can be highly skilled. And here, Gallagher and Mia Burnett have written a piece, and they cite Ramstead et al. 2016 for the idea that cultural practice is integrated into affordance, and Carvalho for the idea that aesthetic appreciation of art requires skill. Arango 2019 has a similar idea. But I want to point out specifically, even though they might say that it's included as part of that, that it's also intentional art that's created after that uptake. A good explication of how this works that complements my view of the entrained habitual skill needed for a dancing style that is a marker of characteristic rather than one-off activity can also be found in Miyahara et al.'s piece, What the Situation Affords, Habit and Heedful Interrelations in Skilled Performance. So it's Miyahara, Taylor Ransom, and Sean Gallagher. So this piece explains how heedful performance modifies Week and Roberts' view of heedful performance by showing that there's no conflict between heed and habit. Instead, they show that heed during performance can be part of skilled habitual practice, that it's both habit-based in some of its elements of flow and cognitively aware, noting that in skilled musical performance, mind, on Aili and understanding, refers to a disposition to act in a certain manner or style. That emphasis is mind. My view is similar to this. I don't think that there's any either or in terms of cognition or flow. I think both of them work together on different levels of thought, and that's perfectly reasonable. Indeed, were dance performers not heedful to the needs of navigating highly dangerous terrain of injury, as well as to the challenging nuances of guiding their movement stylistically, then no dancing would stick to the choreographically prescribed temporality, or such as dancing to music, or the spatiality of the pieces. We couldn't refrain from falling off the stage that we need for successful performance. So in their article, A Rich Landscape of Affordances, Rietveld and Kiverstein argue, quote, argue that the affordances an environment offers to an animal are dependent on the skills the animal possesses, close quote, within a specific context, what they call a particular ecological niche. We've heard this phrase earlier this week, which for human beings includes sociocultural practices that require both lower and higher order cognitive capacities. They then say that these practices can become patterned in, quote, normative behaviors and customs of our communities, close quote, noting that, quote, what is common to human beings is not just the biology we share, but also our being embedded in sociocultural practices, our sharing steady ways of living with others, our relatively stable ways of going on, close quote. They're just borrowing Wittgenstein's term form of life here in a way that's similar but not identical to how Wittgenstein uses the term. I'm not a very strict historian when it comes to doing that sort of thing either. I call myself a Dewey-N rather than historically faithful. All right, so let me think. Oh, where am I? I'm sorry. Okay, I think this view is broadly equivalent to, or at least compatible with, the accounts of cultural permeation and cultural emergence previously provided. I also think their idea of form of life as the kind of regular pattern cultural practices of a human being within their niche is well suited to explain the process of artistic entrainment in dance that I earlier explained was part of the skilled and habitual ways of moving in a dancer that create their artistic schema and give rise to their ability to perform in a style. Rietveld and Kiverstein would call what I've described inskillment, following Tim Ingold, and I think they're right to treat these practices as involving higher cognition. In a later article, and I'm not sure how you say this name, it's Luger van Dijk, perhaps, and Eric Rietveld describe the uptake and output of affordances within the particular ecological niche of human beings as a, quote, skilled intentionality framework. Oh, sorry for the typo on this page. This is useful for explaining the intentionality component of dancing style. And in addition, they take care to point out that the lived perspective of the intentional agent, which is akin to my view of individual artistry, foregrounds the uptake of affordances. All right, so why do I have the sense that cognitive integration is not for me? I'm going to explain that. In his 2018 article entitled Cognitive Integration, How Culture Transforms Us and Extends Our Cognitive Capabilities, Richard Menery agrees with the following, that, quote, phylogenetically early forms of cognition in humans involve sensory motor interactions with the environment. These are built upon by more recent cultural innovations, which are a product of cultural evolution and niche construction, close quote. He then goes on to say, however, that, quote, the key cultural innovations are symbolic representations and that the normative cognitive practices that govern their manipulation are ostensibly symbolic as well and representational. These claims form the crux of Menery's cognitive integration theory, CI, and he holds that transmitting representational systems, those are his words, transmitting them, is the main form of the social learning that takes place in culture, the main form, okay? I agree that many of the cultural innovations that are part of learning a taught style are symbolic representations, and that these representations can serve as stylistic markers. Some of the hand signals in hip hop dance, for example, are symbolic of membership in a particular crew, markers of what I've called style T. The fact that this is true, however, does not mean that our capabilities for uptake of these representations rely on computational thought as an add-on or alone. I can understand the meaning of these symbols in both computational ways. I can say, hey, that symbol belongs to Cronstedt's crew, or in ways that involve the body and affect. That crew sign sets my teeth on edge. I'm not feeling it. I don't get the vibe, right? Menery goes to great lengths to deny that he believes that he says Hutto and Mayan claim he does, that all cultural capacities rely on representations, though, citing chapter 5 of his 2007 essay, chapter 5 of his book. The essay is called The Evolution of the Hybrid Mind, for his explication of this idea. I need to look at this a bit further in order to see what I can make of this claim when I read this piece, which I have yet to do. But on its face, this purported refutation doesn't seem to deny the possibility that Menery thinks that representational uptake operates in some way that involves a separate process of thinking. Menery also holds that culture can be explained in biological terms, which I think means he's a naturalist all the way down. And I do mean from top to down. It's the top-down direction of social learning here that concerns me and others, including Clark and Chalmers, 1998, Hutto and Mayan, 2013, Rupert, 2009 and 2008, Steiner, Sorelny, and compare this with Adams and Aizawa. Immediately then, there's a conflict with the view of cultural emergence mentioned earlier, since this view denies that culture is reducible to biology, and I'm less clear on whether it's compatible with the cultural permeation view. See Arango, 2019, for another view like mine that holds that biological explanations are not enough to account for culture. A difference is that he locates cultural richness in perception and not perception and intentional activity as I do. All right. I also want to preliminarily reject Menery's claim that his account of cognitive integration is needed for higher order thinking, which he describes as the kind of thinking that's addressed to cognitive tasks. If one believes that mechanistic and computational thought has been made possible by and is continuous with the sort of thought that arises from embodied, embedded, and interactive processes, then I'm not sure why we need a separate set of processes for computational tasks. In addition, higher order thought includes more than computation or tasks. As I've mentioned earlier, I think the thought involved in perceiving and performing in a dancing style is higher order when it's done at a high level of complexity and sophistication after extended practice and expertise development within the cultural domain of dance. Nor do I agree with those theorists who want to say that artistic expression does not emerge from functional goal-directed thought. It's not brute, output of naive, emotion. That would be more like what the dogs are doing in Michelle's piece. Indeed, I may know as a dancer that in order to achieve the aesthetic effect of wistfulness, I need to linger in the timing of a farewell balletic gesture and lower my eyes and head slowly as I depart. Doing these things are not themselves complex movements, but they become complex as they're done as part of the expressive meaning of the dance. It becomes sophisticated to do that in a way that marks you as having an individual style. Menery would perhaps concede that there is higher order thought involved in dance performance when dancers memorize the sequence of steps and think about which order to perform them in. But there's much more to dancing style than that. And if this were a longer piece, I would give you nice videos of style, and I'm a little sad I didn't have time to do that. Right. In conclusion, I do think that the Enactivist accounts of Sean Gallagher, Daniel Hutto, and Eric Rietveld, among others, provide a plausible framework for understanding dancing style. I think that any purported cognitive gap, that's something I didn't really mention, but I'm just flagging it here, something for me to think about later, between these views and higher order cognition can be eliminated by the simple acknowledgement that planning, goal directedness, and complexity are all part and parcel of what happens when culture and biology interact within the life of a culturally embedded human person or within a skilled intentionality framework. What remains to be determined for me is the question of cultural permeation versus emergence mentioned earlier. And I welcome your thoughts on this and on anything else. I have a whole bunch of pages of references. I'm not going to bore you with showing them, but if you want to know what some of these are, or if there are any references that I made that you want the full site for, just ask me and I will do that. Right, and that's it.
Okay, let's give Aili a big hand. That was excellent. Thank you so much for that. Per usual, go ahead and send me your cues and I will go down the line. Okay, Sean is up first.
Okay, yeah, thanks. This is very nice. There's so much to agree with, as you might imagine. I guess I'm thinking about Richard Minari's integration idea, and he's coming out of an extended mind tradition. So that's one of the 4 E's. So I'm wondering what you think of that, because there is some work in extended mind, on performance and the importance of whatever stage and other people and so forth and so forth. But his notion of integration is sort of comes out of that. He wants to somehow or other allow there to be, those types of things you talk about in the extended mind tradition, embodied body schema type stuff, and then also I think he's very much influenced by Clarke's idea of action-oriented representations. So I guess my question is simply, what do you think about the extended mind idea? And if you think there's something valuable there, then how would you integrate, or how would you bring those together with the enactive? Easy question.
Yeah, thank you for this question. At first, I was scared of enactivism, and so I just stuck with Andy Clarke because it seemed like it was easier to learn one thing, 3 E's rather than 4. So I've thought about this a little bit, and I think that one of the differences, as I see it, if I'm right about this, and you'll tell me, is that the extended mind thesis still kind of wants to retain this seat of executive control. They still want this, they don't want to acknowledge that what has made our capacities to have executive control in the first place is movement and the body. And I had to really look at that and really be convinced that that was true. And it happened when I started thinking really about how it is that, I didn't even think about this in a dance context. I was looking at Michael Jordan. How is it that this basketball player can do it at the uber level, not just regularly getting a thing in the hole, a ball in the hole, but somebody that can do it with ease, although it's highly skilled. And when I started thinking about that, I came into contact with Barbara Montero's view of thought and action, and I think there's more physically, habitually entrained, skilled there than the extended mind theory wants to say that there is. They want to hold on to a thinking person that isn't giving themselves over to other sorts of dynamical processes. I'm also finding myself more and more as I get older, convinced by Merleau-Ponty's view that once we do something, we've already gotten prepared to do it in bodily ways. I mean, I think about this when I almost have a car crash or something happens just because I remember how to do it. And now as an older dancer who's weak and some of those things are falling apart, the thing that happens if I try to do a high level ballet move is that I remember that all I needed to do was think about my right knee and that triple pirouette would happen. Well, that's what used to be the case because my body would take care of the rest. But now my body's in a state of disarray and disrepair. And so whatever I would need to do has to be really adjusted because there's some shelf life for the entrainment and how long that you can rely on it. So I really think that I don't know. I've really become more convinced that there is something that is in the as somebody said, pre-reflective grounding of this whole story that's embodied at a deep level, and that the extended mind theory is worried about giving up executive control, is worried about the ideas. I know that I think that Barbara Montero is anyway, that people believe that genius is something that just happens to you and you'd have no thought involved and dancers aren't smart or something like that. But I don't think that while I'm sympathetic to wanting to hold on to that control, I have noticed that the very highest level that I could achieve in dance performance doesn't happen when I'm thinking that way. It's something that has to have been practiced 100 million times, and that I believe that it's part of doing that, kind of like what Michelle was saying about part of the playing where you get smarter over time that develops the capacities. So I don't know if that would satisfy the extended mind people, but that's my thinking.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Okay, excellent. And you read my dissertation, Aili, so we think very similarly about this issue of executive control. Okay, I have Matthew.
Hi, Aili. Thank you so much for your talk. I guess I'm thinking more in a practical rather than theoretical way, which is really nice. And thinking about my experience, for instance, as a professional, going from like a rehearsal with Randy James and then going to a rehearsal with Sean Curran, and thinking about how style is nested differently with those two things, and at what levels am I consciously aware, like, oh, now I'm going to Sean's rehearsal, I need to become this kind of dancer. And that sort of where is that sort of top-down recognition versus what do I learn just through practice there? But then also thinking about like, who am I through all of those contexts, right? So I still walk the same. If we're going to be walking on stage, I still walk like me. So these sort of like, what is my style as an identity? And then how do I both from the bottom up and top down learn styles as I work across different choreographers? And then obviously in an educational context, I begin to think about how we facilitate this for dancers, where we want them to dance the style of the piece, but we also want them to be themselves in the dance, right? They can't get themselves over. So I don't know, I was just sort of thinking about that sort of nested quality and how we persist through it. And there's not really a question in there, but I was just sort of thinking about that complexity.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I have some thoughts on it. I mean, if you can see a ballet dancer in the grocery store because they're walking like a duck, right? So in a way, like they might be their natural selves in the grocery store. But if they're in a Yvonne Rainer piece or a Judson Church group and they're shopping for something in a grocery store, but it's on stage and it's designed to be an artistic product, I think there it's not just it's a different you go into a different mode. I don't think one's top down when you're doing a style of someone's piece, and one's bottom up. I think they're both bottom up, but you decide that you're speaking in French rather than English, but that there's nothing that needs to come from the top in order to learn to pull from my toolbox of things that I've learned. And so yes, I would need to say to myself, wait a minute, I just went to foreign language mode, but what came out was Spanish, not French, and self-correct. And you're always being, a critic as well as a performer while you're doing that. But I think that it's part of being an artist at a high level to know how to adapt the taught styles and how to perform within it. And that perhaps I'm always going to have, a certain recognizable, Billie Holiday kind of way of singing in every blues, or jazz song that I sing, but maybe not. Maybe I've got an Aili artistic style when I'm doing neoclassical balancing ballet, and I've got an Aili artistic style when I'm doing Merce Cunningham that is cognizant of the fact that I'm in a different domain and that I've got a different, and I'm pulling from a different toolbox when I'm doing that. Although to some extent there's a unity of the self, that I have the toolbox that has both those things in it. And it doesn't hurt if some of my balletic capacities can help me to jump higher in the Merce Cunningham or something like that. But that's kind of how I think about it, if I've answered kind of what you were getting at.
Great. Okay, Petronella.
Thank you, Aili. That was really rich, and I could ask many questions. I think there were certain things I didn't really quite have the time to follow, and I just wanted some clarification about this idea of cultural permeation that I find very, of course, interesting. I mean, it's roughly an idea that is central, of course, in Merleau-Ponty's thought, and that connects many different topics, not only, of course, aesthetics. But just one really small thing was the relation between cultural penetration and cultural permeation, and what the difference was. And then more largely, how did that issue connect with the idea of style? There was something there I didn't follow, but it was because it was quick and so many thoughts came up. So I would just, I just would like you to say something more about that. Thank you.
Sure. Obviously, I've handled cultural permeation with very primitive tools of the beginning person who's understanding this. But my understanding is that permeation takes place kind of laterally or horizontally or bottom up, and that one of the things I didn't mention that Sean Gallagher talks about in the book that I recommend, Action and Interaction, is the massive hermeneutical background, and in which culture permeates what we do. Penetration I see as more like what Minari was talking about, where I make recourse to certain symbols, or what I think Matthew Henley sounded like he was describing, like that I go and select from a top shelf, cereal, because that's what I want to eat today or something like that. And that it's penetrating something that's already there. Whereas I think permeation doesn't have culture as this separate thing. It's already always there from the beginning. And perhaps, and this is what I need to find out more, in Margolis's view, it has made it possible for me to uptake any of the affordances to begin with. It's made it, the fact that I have language means that I can learn. The fact that I have, that any of my capacities to be a cultural agent in Margolian terms have happened because I'm an encultured person rather than a Homo sapien. And so that would be, you didn't ask me about that, but that's how I see it. If I've got things confused. Oh, and you asked me about style and how it connects to style. Well, how I think it connects to style is that if I'm thinking about dancing, when I originally, this may be this answers Sean Gallagher's question. When I was originally just in the 3E camp of Andy Clark, I was thinking about two separate processes, right? I was thinking about whether I was going to dance in an individual style or I was going to dance in a taught style. And when I started thinking, in more of an enactivist way, I realized that the two are really combined. It's not all individual style is emergent from what I've been taught in culture. At one point, Joe Margolis sat me in his office and said, told me I was a cultural agent, and I said, no, you're crazy. That this was early. I have complete freedom. I can do whatever I want. I'm a genius, you know. I would like to be a genius, and to be a genius, I have to have complete freedom, right? Because I don't believe in platonic forms of genius. Anyway, and he said, okay, try to do something. And I said, what do you mean try to do something? He said, do something dance. Do something dance that's completely original, completely individual, completely genius or on the way, right? And as soon as I started dancing in ballet steps, I knew I was sunk. Because whatever new thing I was going to create or assemble was prefigured, was pre-encultured, was possible because I had these ways of, and I was so upset that I couldn't figure out a brand new way of moving. And even when I tried to do something new, it looked like Isadora Duncan or Twyla Tharp or something. And so anyway, that's how I think it connects to style, if that is helpful.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Sabine.
Thank you, Aili, for that excellent talk. I learned so much, even though I had problems to follow the speed and I only got half of it, but I learned so much already from kind of understanding half of it. So thank you. I'll probably go back to it when we have the gravations to listen to it again to get even more out of it. There were so many very interesting references for me and all of that. I just wanted to come back to the last thing that you said. You had this question about culture, and I didn't understand what the question was. So I wanted for you to describe the question that is open for you, that you put in the end of your conclusions, one more time so that I can understand the question.
Yeah, so I have this idea of a person being encultured, and of culture of being emergent, and of my activity of moving being emergent from Joseph Margolis. And his view is not based in neuroscience. It's based in his own brand of Wittgensteinian pragmatism combined with Peirce, combined with some work he reads has read in sociology. He died recently, so it's hard for me. Sorry, it's hard for me to speak about him in the past tense. And he reads Continental, and he reads Nagarjuna, and he's just a polymath, which is also interesting because he's an outlier and not just strictly explainable in terms of cultural agency. So what I'm trying to figure out, because I was indoctrinated in that view, and for good reasons, not because he forced it, but because I was really compelled by it and thought it was interesting in graduate school, and developed my view of style that way. And so when I'm coming into now looking at cognitive science, kind of extensions of some of the people that inspired Margolis, I'm looking at, I was looking first at extended mind theories of Andy Clark and David Chalmers, and now trying to move into enactivism. I am trying to figure out whether the commonalities that cultural permeation have and how it's described are close enough, or another way of, or a better way of this cultural emergence idea that I know so well, and what to make of that. And so I think that it's thoroughly naturalistic. My ears were perking up a little bit when Michelle Merritt was talking about additional ease of enculturation, because I don't know that literature and I need to look at that. But I'm curious. I don't want to be such a poor scholar that I just stay with the one theory that I know well that I started with. But I started with it and stayed with it because it had resonance for me, because it meant something to me, because I thought it was true in some way and could explain some things that other theories couldn't. So I'm going to need to piece out whether this idea of cultural permeation, first of all, I'm going to have to get it right and understand it, and get memory right and understand it, which I'm already, very weak at. But then try to really do the analysis and comparison and see where my theory needs to be, and what the and that's what I meant. So it's an open question, if that's helpful.
Wonderful. Okay, Idil.
Hey, thank you for the talk. So I'm just thinking about around the biology, culture, and how really we make sense of aesthetics, or our as a perceiver and also as the creator. So I'm just thinking, do we really need a society to think about the culture? So because I'm thinking from more the dance and movement therapy perspective, and please, if people know more, can correct me. So in the process of creation, if one person creates a movement, then also is affected by this production or the creative process, and then reflects onto some thoughts, or some emotions arise, and the creative process just keeps going. It's kind of a feedback and the production loop. And by that, I can think as an individual, being a biology, and also creating a product and being affected by that. So creating kind of a culture itself. So that's why I'm just thinking, do we really need a society to create that culture out of the boundary of the person? Or can we really think this as a really individual experience of creating this artistic production and really being affected by that? And this is, I'm just a bit relating it to the William James sentence. You mentioned the role of sensation in thinking. So I just tackle with these topics. And do you have anything to combine or to say relating to your work?
Yeah. Well, when I think about biology, right, and what Margolis has written about in terms of the difference between a Homo sapien and a person, I think about well, one of the things that he mentions is the existence of reflexivity and the existence of a self, the ability to think of oneself as a self, and someone that has language. And so it's a certain, he's naturalistic in that that's a certain level along the biological evolutionary path. And yet biological evolution goes slower and sometimes than cultural evolution. They're on separate tracks. Like if there's a war or we have a horrible new president, everything can change right away. Whereas my abilities, to reach a tree leaf or something are going to be much slower. But your question is, do we need a society? I'm not sure that I think of society. I'm not sure how to think about society, and you're right to point out that there's some weird kind of conflation going on between societal context and culture, and I need to look at that a little bit more. But anytime I want to understand symbols or signs or semiotics, or that the stop sign means to stop, or that in a dance form that certain things mean you will die in ballet, or some of those sorts of things. I can't imagine learning those things in a context that didn't include a society of some sort, especially societal affordances like parents who have money to pay for my ballet lessons, a certain culture that's made it normative for little girls to take ballet class. My parents didn't know much about ballet, but they thought that little girls should take ballet, or those sorts of, all of those things are so bound up in whatever you would say is my biology, that I hardly know how to make sense of myself without thinking of myself as, you know, the product of these two particular people who was born in 1969 in New York City, East Harlem. I don't, maybe I shouldn't date myself, but these sort of cultural things are more important to me than my DNA, my fingerprint, or I think are more determinative, or as determinative as my biology and being able to make something dance-wise. So I don't know whether by society you mean something socio-political or some kind of form of government or something, but I think those systems of norms and those systems of in which you develop a skill really affect how that skill turns out.
Yeah, thank you. I was trying to kind of separate or create a boundary of the culture that you defined in the work. So what kind of components I should think about when I think culture that kind of is in, yeah, creating this cultural permeation in individual. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way that I think of it is a certain set of practices that's in a particular domain. I think I do follow right, Bill, in that way, and thinking now of thinking it as a ecological niche. But I do need to do some more work on that and make sure that I understand what I think about that and whether I should be using the terms interchangeably or not. I mean, similarly, I'm not sure how to use the term social cognition. I don't know what that means in connection to my view.
Okay, so we have time for the quickest of questions. So Michelle, if it's a quick question, we might have time for it, if there is such a thing in academia.
Well, you just segued into my question with social cognition. So I was going to ask you, I don't know how quick it can be, but I wanted to know how much of style connects up with social cognition. Like there has to be this kind of, I don't have a really well-formed question, but that to even approach having a style or to even recognize that one has a style, there's the implication of the other having uptake as recognizing that style as such. Like you can't, it's very intersubjective is what I'm trying to say. And that there can be style misalignments. Like I think I'm inhabiting Cunningham's style, but actually it's not. And but I don't know that until everybody's looking at me weird or until, you know, something's gone horribly wrong. So these misalignments that I was talking about could be maybe one way to understand style, that like you can't have it without some kind of participatory sense making. And I was thinking, I guess I was wondering if you had looked at any of this in conjunction to, besides mind reading and that kind of idea that I would recognize that somebody else is watching me and that they might not think it's the style that I intend it to be, but also in terms of like speech act theory, you know, like the fact that speech acts for Austin are often performative. And so you're doing something when you talk, just like you're doing something when you perform a dance and you're hoping to communicate a style to the other. So I didn't know if that would help you or like confuse you or just.
No, I think that's really helpful. I haven't looked at speech acts theory, but I'm actually, or at least I've committed to write something on dance as political speech acts for a theater book. And I have a law background. And so I've thought about the extent to which political dance and protest and such can be speech. And I guess I've thought a lot about interpretation, and I've thought a lot about what the audience brings to the equation in order to detect this style. I mean, I do think that not everything that I'm putting out there is going to be taken up by every audience member, that some of the higher level stuff is only the ballet mains are going to be able to get, and then some more basic stuff everybody can get. But that there is, I do think that there are, that part of the dance experience that includes the audience includes much more exchange than what I've discussed today, and involves a context of interpretation, and I could say something about purse and thirdness and musical performance. But I think that a lot of what Carlos was talking about last night connects with my thinking there. I mean, I think that the idea Misalignment is a good one. Just because I put something out there that, you know, that the 2% of the population will get, if that, doesn't necessarily mean that I've done something communicative in a broader sense, right? And to what extent and then that gets into questions of subcultures, because sometimes you're doing things for people in a very small group, that group of balletamains that are counting how many fouettes you're doing, and they know if you're going to do less than 32, versus the regular audience that's just going, wow, that's a lot of spinning on one leg, right? And so yeah, there's more to be said about the audience part of things, and you're right that I shouldn't forget about that. Did I sort of answer it? I hope so.
Curiosity about how that all fit in. So.
Okay, I think we should give Aili another big hand. This was very excellent. And also another hand to Michelle, of course. I'm really sad to say that sort of brings us to the end of this week and of our programming together. I, for once, have had an excellent time, and I couldn't think of a better way to end my time in graduate school than to bring all of you together. It's been really special for me. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here. This has been so great. All the talks are going to be on YouTube. So in a week or so, probably, they will be in the conference schedule on the same website, and you can rewatch and think about the glory days when you're in the embodied cognition lecture series with us. But again, thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Really appreciate it. I'm going to leave the room open for a little bit to chit chat if anyone wants to hang around, but otherwise, again, thank you.
And let's congratulate Christian on successfully finishing his dissertation and getting his PhD.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for the conference. And to Sean too.
It was Christian who really did the organization and all the hard work. So thank you, Christian. I think it was very successful.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you for letting me do this. It's been really great.